The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer over Oak Creek Memorial's ICU in Savannah, a sound that had become as familiar to Laura Bennett as her own heartbeat. She moved through the unit at 6:48 a.m. with the kind of invisibility that only comes from 3 years of being underestimated, her white sneakers making no sound against the polished tile, her hand steady as she prepped the morning medications for beds 3 through 9. The antiseptic smell wrapped around her like a familiar coat, bleach and hope and the faint copper edge of things that could go wrong. She was nothing special here. Just a nurse. That was exactly how she needed it to stay. The unit had 17 beds. Laura knew every one of them the way a sailor knows the ocean. Bed 1, Mr. Castellano, post-op cardiac bypass, breathing easy, vitals stable for 12 hours. Bed 3, Mrs. Chen, septic from a urinary tract infection that had metastasized into her bloodstream, fever spiking despite the antibiotics Dr. Hargrove had ordered yesterday. Bed 7, that was where the veteran lay, a man named Kovac who'd had his valve replaced 4 days ago, his eyes following her every movement with the kind of recognition that made her spine go rigid. She avoided the veterans' wall in the lobby every morning. The photographs there, young soldiers in dress uniforms, service years listed beneath their names like epitaphs, had a way of reaching into her chest and squeezing. 3 years she'd worked here, and not once had she stopped to read the names. Not once had she let anyone know that she understood what those photographs meant, what those lives had cost, because understanding meant explaining, and explaining meant the quiet she'd fought so hard to build would shatter like glass. Laura inserted the 4 catheter into Mrs. Chen's left forearm with surgical precision. One smooth motion. The needle went in at a 15-degree angle, threading through the vein wall like muscle memory made manifest. 14 years of that, 14 years of field hospitals and forward operating bases and hands that had learned to work in darkness and dust and the screams of men who'd seen things no human should see. Her knuckles bore the scars to prove it, a thin line of white scar tissue across her index and middle finger from a piece of shrapnel in Marja. Another gouge along her wrist from a ricochet. These hands had held pressure on arterial bleeds while mortars fell. These hands had sutured wounds in places where the concept of sterile technique was a luxury only the lucky got to keep. But here at Oak Creek Memorial, they were just hands. Invisible hands. Competent, but forgettable. Fluid balance looks better, she said quietly to the tech assigned to bed 3. 23-year-old kid named Marcus who was still figuring out what it meant to actually care about people instead of just processing them. Yeah? Marcus glanced at the chart. I thought her output was down. 1,200 milliliters in. 820 out. The gap's narrowing. Laura hung the fresh for bag with smooth efficiency. Her kidney function's improving. Give it another shift. Marcus nodded, trusting her because that's what people did. They trusted the quiet ones who never made mistakes. They trusted that if you didn't speak much, you probably knew what you were doing. What they didn't know was that Laura had spent 7 months in a field hospital 40 kilometers outside Fallujah, running a medical team that had processed 847 trauma cases with exactly 3 doctors and 2 nurses who were both barely 22 years old. What they didn't know was that she'd learned to read a patient's trajectory the way other people read weather forecasts, not because she was gifted, but because the alternative to precision was body bags stacked in a storage tent. At 7:15 a.m., Dr. Hargrove swept through the ICU for morning rounds. He moved like a man who'd never questioned his own gravity, his white coat pristine, his hair expensive, his tie a shade of blue that cost more than Laura's monthly car payment. He was 47, ambitious in the way that only men with family money could truly be ambitious, untethered from consequences, free to fail upward. He'd been chief of surgery at Oak Creek Memorial for 6 years. Before that, a prestigious hospital in Charleston. Before that, a fellowship at Johns Hopkins where, according to the plaque outside his office, he'd published papers on rapid response protocols that had revolutionized trauma care. He was competent. That was almost worse than if he'd been incompetent. Bennett, he said, not looking at her as she presented Mrs. Chen's vitals. Fluid status. Responding to diuretics. Creatinine down 0.2. She's turning the corner. He made a note on his tablet without acknowledging the work she'd done to make that happen. The 4 residents trailing behind him, young doctors all trying to figure out how to be him, or to become better than him, or to survive him, did the same. They were learning their lessons. The nurses who knew things weren't the ones to respect. The ones to respect were the ones with titles behind their names. Laura moved to bed 7 to check on Kovac while Hargrove was on the other side of the unit with his entourage. The veteran was watching her with the kind of attention that made her want to disappear into the wall. His valve replacement had gone textbook, incision healing, cardiac output strong, arrhythmia risk declining by the hour. He should have been discharged yesterday, but a minor fever spike had kept him for observation. Now the fever was gone and he was just waiting, and waiting meant time to think, and thinking meant he was starting to recognize things about the way she moved. "Senior Kai," he began, his voice rough from days of limited conversation. Laura held up one finger to her lips. Just one. Gentle. Not commanding. The kind of gesture a person makes to a friend, not to a subordinate. She squeezed his shoulder once, a touch that meant everything and nothing, and checked his monitor without meeting his eyes. His heart rate was 64, regular sinus rhythm, exactly where it should be. Everything about him was healing correctly. Everything except whatever he thought he recognized. The break room at 8:19 a.m. was a small space with a refrigerator that hummed like it was dying, a microwave that smelled like burnt popcorn from someone's lunch 3 days ago, and a table where the day shift nurses usually congregated before the real work started. Laura had poured her coffee, black, no sugar, the way she drank it in the field and the way she'd never stopped drinking it, when 4 of the day shift nurses who'd been mid-conversation stopped talking. Mid-word, really. One of them, a woman named Jennifer who worked nights in the cardiac unit, stood up with her own cup still 3/4 full and walked toward the sink without making eye contact. The other 3 followed like a school of fish recognizing a predator in the water. Laura sat alone at the table with her coffee and the morning census report and the kind of professional distance that had become her natural state. She didn't watch them leave. She didn't register anything other than the sound of their footsteps on tile, the mechanical click of the refrigerator cycling, the distant beep of a monitor in one of the rooms down the hall. This was normal. This had been normal for 3 years. She was the nurse nobody quite trusted, nobody quite befriended, the one who appeared when you needed her and evaporated when you didn't. Invisible. Valuable but unremarkable. A resource, not a person. The coffee was strong and slightly burnt, and she appreciated it for exactly that. Pain was information. Every bitter note was data. Everything your senses told you was either helping you or killing you, and if you ignored it, you were choosing death. She'd learned that in a place where hospitals were marked on maps with red XS and the sound of helicopters meant either rescue or disaster depending on which direction they were coming from. At 8:56 a.m., as she was finishing the last of her coffee, the overhead intercom crackled with static. It was the page operator's voice, calm and professional, doing the job she'd done 10,000 times before. Code Blue, Memorial Day Ceremony Site. Incoming ETA 8 minutes. One patient, approximately 70 years old, unresponsive, found collapsed near the flagpole. Trauma team stand by. Laura set down her cup. The ceramic made a small sound against the table, just a click, but in that moment everything shifted. The fluorescent light seemed to hum a different frequency. The air pressure changed the way it does before a storm, when barometric pressure drops and every living thing feels it in their bones. 8 minutes. A 70-year-old who'd been at a Memorial Day ceremony. Unresponsive. The vagueness of the report meant they didn't know what was wrong yet, which meant it was either something obvious or something catastrophic. She stood, disposed of her cup, and walked back toward the ICU. Around her, the hospital had shifted into that particular state of readiness that happens when something major is coming through the doors. She could hear it in the way people moved faster, the way conversation stopped mid-sentence, the way the energy in the building compressed like a fist closing. Laura moved into bed 2, which was currently empty, and began the pre-arrival protocol, setting up the monitor, checking the crash cart, ensuring the defibrillator pads were in reach, laying out the equipment in the order it would be needed. Her hands knew what to do. Her hands had always known what to do. What happened next didn't just change the day. It changed everything. The unresponsive Admiral arrived at 11:51 a.m. on a Monday, his body wheeled in by paramedics whose radios crackled with the clinical language of collapse during a Memorial Day ceremony, and Oak Creek Memorial's ICU erupted into controlled chaos. Laura Bennett was charting at the nurse's station when the code announcement echoed through the intercom, her hands already moving toward the trauma bay before her conscious mind had processed the words, muscle memory pulling her toward the sound of crisis the way compass needles find north. The Admiral's family filled the waiting room in dress uniforms, navy white starched crisp as new money, medals catching fluorescent light, a son who had his father's jaw and his father's bearing, a wife whose hands moved from her throat to her purse to her throat again in the endless cycle of helplessness. Laura pushed through the ICU doors and saw him immediately. The Admiral lay seizing, his body rigid against the mattress, his eyes rolled back in a way that meant nothing good, and every clinical bell in her training rang at once. She moved toward him with the kind of automatic precision that comes from 3 tours in field hospitals where hesitation got people killed, her eyes already cataloging the subtle signs, the distended neck veins, the muffled heart sounds on initial auscultation, the way his skin had taken on that particular grayish cast that whispered pericardial effusion the way experienced nurses read omens in tea leaves. "I suggest immediate bedside echo," she said quietly, her voice steadier than the earth beneath her feet. The collapse history and these presentations indicate possible cardiac tamponade. We need to visualize fluid accumulation before. Dr. Hargrove stepped between her and the monitor. He was tall in the way powerful men are tall, his white coat pristine, his hands soft and unblemished by anything resembling real work, and when he looked at her the expression in his eyes contained the kind of contempt that needed an audience to truly flourish. Laura had seen that look before, in the faces of men who'd never heard a gunshot outside a television screen, who'd never made decisions that meant someone's child came home in a flag or came home whole. "Nurse Bennett," he said, and his voice carried the particular tone of a man addressing something he'd found stuck to his shoe. "Your role is nursing, not clinical diagnosis. Dr. Chen will manage this case. You will provide basic bedside care and observe protocols. Nothing more." Dr. Chen was already moving into position, a man in his early 30s with the kind of confidence that comes from a residency funded by connections rather than competence, his movements efficient but not practiced, missing the subtle urgency that the Admiral's presentation screamed to anyone who'd actually spent time in a trauma environment. The Admiral's family pressed against the observation window, his son's eyes tracking every movement, every decision, and Laura felt the moment before it happened the way animals feel the pressure drop before a storm. She did not move away. She opened her mouth to speak about the specific ultrasound angles that would visualize the pericardial space, about the equipment they'd need staged, about the timeline that cardiac tamponade followed like clockwork, and that's when Dr. Hargrove turned, his hand raised as though to physically block her, which he did, his palm flat against her shoulder, pushing her backward with a force that was more about dominance than physics. "In my ICU," he said, his volume rising just enough to ensure that the Admiral's gathered family heard every word, heard it clearly, understood that this was a performance and they were the intended audience. "We follow the chain of command. I am the chief of surgery. Dr. Chen is the attending. You are a nurse. The difference is not one of degree. It is fundamental. Your job is to follow orders. Not to play doctor. Not to offer clinical recommendations. Not to waste the time of physicians with your correspondent school observations." He paused. The Admiral's son's jaw had gone tight. These flag cases require actual expertise. The kind that comes from years of medical training. Not whatever gave you your license. Dr. Chen smiled. It was a small, poisonous thing. Laura took one measured breath. Her hands did not shake. Her voice did not crack. She felt something in her chest that might have been anger or might have been grief or might have been the particular clarity that comes when you realize you've been living a lie for 3 years and the lie has just evaporated like water on hot pavement. A single tear traced down her cheek, not from fear, not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of what she was about to lose. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Dr. Hargrove. "I was offering clinical observation, doctor," she said quietly, her voice like a submarine surfacing through ice. "I apologize for the confusion." She turned and walked out of the ICU, her pace measured, her spine straight, every inch of her body broadcasting a composure that made the Admiral's son watch her departure more intently than he watched the monitors surrounding his father. Behind her, Dr. Hargrove had already forgotten she existed. That was always the danger with men like him. They could hurt you, but they couldn't see you doing the hurting back. The afternoon break room was a fluorescent-lit purgatory where nurses retreated to eat sad lunches and argue about staffing. Laura sat alone with black coffee that had gone room temperature and bitter, her hands wrapped around the mug like it might provide warmth, like anything could provide warmth. She was staring at nothing when Jessica, Tom, Maria, and Katie came through the door mid-conversation, their voices overlapping about shift coverage and supply chain problems and the usual hospital noise. They saw her. All four of them saw her simultaneously, their eyes meeting hers for approximately 1/4 of a second, a moment of recognition that was immediately revised into something else, a glance past, a visual dismissal, a decision made in unison as though they'd rehearsed it. They stood. Chairs scraped against linoleum like the sound of words being deliberately unspoken. They left. Four of them moving in a cluster toward the door, their shoulders angled away from her table, their conversation resuming before they'd fully cleared the room, the careful casualness of people pretending that nothing significant had just occurred. The silence they left behind was a presence. Laura sat in it the way you sit in a cold room and wait for the heat to come back, and it never does. Her hand shook once around her mug. Just once. She pressed her palm flat against the table and it stopped. By evening, a formal write-up had appeared on the unit board in the main nurses' station, not pinned, displayed where evening shift would see it, where night shift would catalogue it, where every nurse moving through the station would slow just slightly to read the printed condemnation. It was written in the particular language of hospital bureaucracy, the kind of clinical precision usually reserved for patient conditions. Disciplinary notice. Insubordination and unauthorized clinical recommendations. Staff, L. Bennett. Violation, employee overstepped scope of practice by offering unsolicited clinical assessments to attending physician. Violation, failure to remain in designated lane. Violation, insubordination toward chief of surgery. Dr. Hargrove's signature was bold at the bottom. Unapologetic. Permanent. Laura was reviewing the Admiral's updated chart when Katie appeared beside her. Young Katie with her nursing school diploma still smelling of fresh ink, her confidence still intact, her career not yet shaped by the 1,000 small humiliations that came with being a woman in a profession where men held the titles and the power and the authority to decide what you could and could not do. "Maybe you should just stay in your lane, Laura," Katie said, her voice pitched low enough to sound sympathetic, high enough to ensure that anyone within 10 feet could hear it clearly. Laura set down her clipboard. She took one measured breath. She felt her chest expand with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived things that would have broken someone who wasn't built to survive them. Let one tear trace its path down her cheek. Not from fear. Not from pain. From the particular clarity of watching someone so young make the same small calculations about safety and complicity that had become the default operating system of institutions everywhere. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Katie. "I was in my lane," she said quietly, each word a stone dropped into still water. "You just can't see all the roads I've traveled." Katie stepped back. Her face had gone pale in a way that suggested she'd just realized she'd miscalculated something fundamental. She left without responding, which was exactly the right instinct. That night, Laura picked up a second consecutive shift. 2 nurses had called out and the scheduling board showed her name filling the void, covering the ICU for another 12 hours, which meant another 12 hours of watching Dr. Chen manage the Admiral's case without catching what she could see plainly as sunset light moved across the monitors. The Admiral's vital signs had stabilized after the seizure, his sedation deep, his body paralyzed and intubated, every system supported by the machinery that kept complicated human bodies running when their own systems failed. But the signs were there for anyone who knew how to read them. In bed 7, a man named Marcus Wade, Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Wade, according to the chart, recovering from a valve replacement, former Marine with shoulders that still carried the shape of body armor even after it had been removed, watched her move through the rows of unconscious patients with a precision that wasn't entirely nursing. He waited until nearly 2 in the morning, until the lights had dimmed and the night shift had settled into the quiet rhythm of their routines, the monitors providing the only conversation anyone was having. "I was Army, not Navy," he said when Laura came to check his voice rough from intubation that had been removed 3 days prior. "But I know combat medicine when I see it. You've got the look." 3 tours? 4. Laura's hand stilled on his full line. She did not look at him. She did not answer. But her hand trembled once against the catheter, a betrayal of the composure that usually held her together like concrete and rebar. He nodded slowly. "Whoever you were," Marcus said, and his voice carried the weight of something understood, "you earned the right to walk away. But seems like it followed you here." At 1:24 a.m., Laura reviewed the Admiral's chart again, her notes documenting every subtle shift in fluid balance, every measurement of jugular venous pressure, every notation about the muffled heart sounds that Dr. Chen had documented and dismissed as normal post-seizure artifact. She paged the on-call surgeon, Dr. Rodriguez, who answered on the second ring with the kind of irritation that came from being woken at that hour. "Suggest immediate echocardiogram," she said quietly. "Fluid accumulation indicators suggest possible tamponade development." "Bennett," Rodriguez said, and his voice carried the distinct tone of a man who'd already had this conversation with Dr. Hargrove. "The chief of surgery has assigned Dr. Chen to this case. Stay in your lane. You'll call the attending if there's a code. Otherwise you do basic nursing care and stop making suggestions that make you sound like you didn't graduate high school." He hung up. Laura sat in the night shift silence and waited for the thing she could see coming with the clarity of someone who'd watched this particular scenario develop in field hospitals 1,000 miles away. At 1:58 a.m., the Admiral's cardiac monitor alarm shrilled into the darkness, a sound like a scream made of electronics, and Laura was already moving before the second beep, already running through the ICU doors while Dr. Chen stumbled out of the on-call room pulling his coat on, already knowing exactly what she would find and exactly what she would have to do about it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came later, when the Admiral was stable again and someone had to explain to Dr. Hargrove that the nurse he'd humiliated on the unit board had just performed the exact procedure he'd forbidden her to recommend, and how that conversation would unfold, and what it would cost her. The scheduling board that evening showed Laura's name covering ICU for another 12 hours. 2 nurses had called out, one citing a migraine, the other a family emergency, and the float pool was already exhausted from covering 3 units at capacity. The charge nurse, Margaret, had approached Laura in the break room with that particular blend of apology and desperation that only existed in understaffed hospitals. "I know there's tension with Hargrove. I know about the write-up. But I don't have anyone else." Laura had simply nodded, finished her coffee, and clocked back in. The decision had taken 2 seconds. The Admiral needed continuity of care, and the protégé doctor, Dr. Chen, was still finding his footing with post-op cardiac cases. She didn't say any of this. She just changed back into clean scrubs and headed to the ICU. The evening rounds moved with the rhythm of any other shift, except nothing felt ordinary anymore. Laura moved from room to room, checking drains, verifying medication orders, noting fluid balance, her hand steady even though she could feel the weight of the write-up like a stone in her pocket. The Admiral lay in room for 12, his chest still wrapped in the post-operative dressing, lines running to monitors that beat their steady electronic pulse. His wife sat in the visitor's chair, a crossword puzzle abandoned in her lap, her eyes following Laura with something that looked like recognition but couldn't be. "Not yet." Dr. Chen stood at the bedside, reviewing the Admiral's chart with the careful concentration of someone reading a foreign language without a dictionary. He was competent enough in theory, Columbia Medical School, top quartile of his residency class, the kind of credentials that looked impressive on a hospital letterhead. But competence and experience weren't the same thing. Theory didn't teach you what cardiac tamponade looked like before it announced itself. Experience did. Muscle memory did. Laura had walked these corridors for 3 years as a civilian nurse, but her hands remembered Marja better than they remembered Savannah. Her eyes recognized subtle changes that charts couldn't capture. She positioned herself at the monitor, ostensibly checking the telemetry readings, and watched the Admiral's vital signs with the attention of someone reading a language she spoke fluently. Blood pressure holding steady at 118/72, acceptable. Heart rate 68, rhythmic. Oxygen saturation 96% on 2 liters of nasal cannula. Surface readings suggested stability. But the fluid balance told a different story. In and out, carefully documented on the flow sheet, 750 milliliters input, only 280 milliliters output over the 8-hour day shift. The math was simple. The accumulation was beginning. Around 11 that night, as the hospital settled into the particular silence of the late evening shift, the kind of quiet that felt like holding your breath, Laura noticed the pulsus paradoxus starting. The blood pressure dropped just slightly with each inspiration, a phenomenon that meant fluid was accumulating around the heart, compressing it like a fist slowly closing. She pulled up the chest X-ray from 6 hours earlier. The cardiac silhouette was enlarging. Not dramatically, not enough for Dr. Chen to have flagged it as an emergency, but enough for someone trained to recognize the progression of cardiac tamponade to understand what was coming. She documented her observations in the electronic medical record with clinical precision: pulsus paradoxus present, muffled heart sounds on auscultation, elevated JVD at 45 degrees, fluid accumulation noted on imaging. She didn't make recommendations. She didn't suggest protocols. She simply documented what she heard, what she measured, what she saw. The burden of interpretation belonged to the physicians. Laura had learned that lesson with brutal clarity on the unit board this afternoon. At midnight, she was restocking the supply cart when Gunny Wade shuffled past her in the hallway. He was recovering from a valve replacement 2 rooms down, and he'd insisted on walking the halls despite the 4-pole, the heart monitor leads visible under his thin hospital gown. His face was still pale from surgery, his movements careful, but his eyes were sharp. He looked at Laura as she passed, actually looked at her, and his pace slowed. "You move different," he said quietly. Not a question. An observation. Laura didn't respond, just nodded slightly and continued down the corridor. Some things didn't need explanation. The night deepened. Visiting hours ended. The Admiral's wife finally agreed to go back to the hotel for a few hours of sleep, kissing her husband's forehead with the tenderness of someone who'd learned not to take tomorrow for granted. Laura promised to call if anything changed, and meant it. At 1:06 a.m., she checked the Admiral's vitals again. Blood pressure dropping. Now 108/68. Heart rate climbing. 82. 84. The pulse was becoming thready, and his breathing had shifted, shallower, more rapid. The fluid was accumulating faster. The heart was working harder. Physics was becoming destiny. She called Dr. Chen on the unit phone. "I need you to reassess the Admiral in room for 12. I'm seeing some concerning changes." Her voice was measured, professional, careful not to overstep the invisible boundary Hargrove had drawn around her authority. Dr. Chen arrived 15 minutes later, stethoscope around his neck, still moving with the slightly uncertain gait of someone still learning to trust his own judgment. He listened to the heart sounds. Looked at the monitors. Reviewed the latest vitals. "Look stable," he said finally. "Maybe a little elevated heart rate, but post-operative cardiac patients often show that. The fluid balance should equalize as his kidney function normalizes." Laura said nothing. She simply nodded and went to check on the other patients. Sometimes the most dangerous moment in medicine wasn't when something was wrong. It was when someone refused to see that it was becoming wrong. At 1:58 a.m., the Admiral's monitor alarmed. Blood pressure had dropped to 96/54. Heart rate was now 106 and climbing. His oxygen saturation was slipping, 94, 92, 90%. The change had happened in moments, the way cardiac tamponade escalated once the pericardial pressure reached critical threshold. Laura was at his bedside in 3 seconds, her hands already reaching for the emergency equipment before her brain had finished processing what she was seeing. The Admiral's eyes were opening, confused and frightened, his hand reaching out as though he could grab something solid in the chaos his body was becoming. The intercom crackled. "Code team to ICU, room for 12. Code blue." Laura's voice was calm, clinical, the voice of someone reporting facts rather than emergency. Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway, his face going pale. The crash cart arrived, stainless steel and wheeled precision, every drawer organized with the careful intention of people who might need to access epinephrine in the dark. The on-call surgeon, Dr. Rodriguez, was 20 minutes out from home. 20 minutes was an eternity when someone's heart couldn't beat inside a prison of accumulated blood. Laura was already moving. She'd grabbed the pericardiocentesis kit from the emergency supplies, a needle smaller than a ballpoint pen but capable of the kind of precision that meant the difference between saving a life and perforating a ventricle. The kit contained everything she needed: the 18-gauge needle, the syringe, the sterile drape and prep. Her hands had done this before, in a field hospital outside Marja where the ambient temperature was 118 degrees and incoming fire meant the work had to be faster than thought. "You can't," Dr. Chen stammered from somewhere that sounded very far away. "You're not authorized. We need to wait for Dr. Rodriguez, we need to." Laura's hands were already moving. Prep, drape, identify landmarks by palpation. The 4th and 5th intercostal spaces. The midclavicular line. The space where a needle, angled correctly, could enter the pericardial sac and drain the fluid that was suffocating the heart. Her fingers found the anatomical markers with muscle memory that made her hands seem like they belonged to someone else, someone with 14 years of surgical experience instead of 3 years as a civilian nurse. She felt the subtle resistance as the needle entered the pericardium, then the soft give as the tip breached into the fluid space beyond. The syringe filled with straw-colored fluid, then darker red. 200 cc. Her hand was steady as a surgical laser, her breathing unchanged even though every monitor in the room was screaming alarm states and her career was dissolving in real time. She drained the accumulated blood, felt the pressure releasing, watched the Admiral's oxygen saturation begin to climb. 92. 94. 96. His heart rate was still elevated but the erratic edge was fading. The rhythm was finding itself again. "Your 3rd Med Battalion," a voice said from the doorway. Gunny Wade was standing there, pole in hand, his hospital gown hanging crooked, his face revealing something between shock and recognition. "I watched you work in Helmand Province. Different sector, different year, but those hands, those are the same hands." He wasn't asking. He was bearing witness. Laura didn't respond. She simply continued working, documenting the procedure, noting time and fluid volume, her voice never wavering as she relayed information to Dr. Chen, who was standing frozen with the weight of what he'd just watched. Dr. Rodriguez arrived 12 minutes later to find the Admiral stable, the fluid drained, the immediate crisis averted. She assessed Laura's work with the clinical eye of someone who'd trained enough residents to recognize competence when she saw it. "Well executed," she said quietly. Then she looked at Dr. Chen. "You were here when this happened." He nodded, shame coloring his entire posture. Rodriguez didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Laura documented everything: time, procedure, findings, outcome, and clocked out at 6 a.m. when the day shift arrived, her shift officially over. The Admiral was sleeping now, his wife would be back in a few hours, and somewhere in the hospital, someone would be calling Dr. Hargrove to explain what had happened in the ICU at 2 a.m. while his chosen protégé stood paralyzed by textbook training that had never encountered real emergency. The Admiral's wife wouldn't arrive until 8 a.m., and by then everything would already be in motion. By 6 a.m., Dr. Hargrove was standing in the ICU hallway with his phone pressed to his ear, his jaw working like he was chewing through nails. He'd been called at home by Dr. Chen, his protégé, who'd admitted with a trembling voice that the Admiral had crashed at 2 a.m., that he'd frozen, that somehow the situation had been stabilized without his authorization. Hargrove's first move was surgical precision: find Chen before anyone else could, coach the narrative, establish the version of events that protected his position. The Admiral coded, Hargrove told him in the empty conference room at 6:36 a.m., his voice low and controlled. You performed an emergency intervention under my indirect supervision. That's our story. Clear. Chen nodded, relief flooding his face. He hadn't wanted to take credit for saving a life he'd had no part in. He just wanted his hands to stop shaking. By 7 a.m., Hargrove was in his office making phone calls. His voice through the closed door was different than it was around staff, sharper, more confident, the voice of a man calling in debts. Marcus, it's Pierce. We have a liability situation at Oak Creek, an authorized procedure by civilian nursing staff, yes, that one, no physician authorization, complete scope violation. The Admiral survived, but that's not the point. That's not the point at all. Yes, I know his family, which is exactly why this needs to be handled quietly. I'm bringing in state investigators by noon. No, she needs to be gone before he's fully conscious, before his family starts asking questions. 3 board members. He called 3 of them between 7 and 8 a.m. Each conversation was a variation on the same theme: liability, protocol violation, the appearance of competence masking incompetence, a civilian nurse playing surgeon while trained physicians stood by. It was masterful, the way he'd learned to reshape facts into institutional self-preservation. Each board member promised to back him. Each one had something to lose if the hospital looked negligent. By 8:15 a.m., Hargrove called the director of the nursing program where Laura had gotten her civilian credentials, a 4-year program designed to train combat medics for hospital transition, rigorous and respected but, in Hargrove's mouth, questionable. He asked pointed questions about her background checks, about whether the program had been fully accredited when she'd enrolled, about gaps in her employment history. He didn't accuse, that was the art of it. He just planted seeds of doubt that would grow in the minds of people who'd never met her. Laura watched this from the nurse's station, her hand steady as she updated charts. She could read the hospital's rhythm like a combat medic reading a battlefield, the whispers that moved through hallways faster than sound, the way eyes didn't quite meet hers anymore, the subtle shift of energy that meant someone's career had just become expendable. She'd survived worse. She'd made worse choices. But knowing what was coming and watching it arrive were 2 different things. At 8:45 a.m., a woman in a dark blazer stepped out of the elevator with a briefcase and clipboard, State Nursing Board investigator, her badge visible, her expression professionally neutral. Hargrove met her in the hallway, his hand on her elbow, already talking, already framing, already winning. Laura saw them pass her station twice before 9 a.m. She didn't turn her head. Her stethoscope hung around her neck like a noose she'd chosen to wear. The conference room call came at 10:03 a.m. Not a request. A summons delivered by HR Director Paulson, whose face held the particular sadness of someone who was about to follow orders he didn't like but would follow anyway because that's what institutions required. Laura walked into the conference room where Hargrove sat with Paulson, the investigator, and 2 board members on speakerphone, their voices tinny through the laptop speaker. Nurse Bennett, the investigator began, you performed a pericardiocentesis at 2:04 a.m. without physician authorization. Laura stood. She didn't sit. It was a small thing but it mattered, the choice to remain standing while they sat, to take up space, to not make herself smaller than the accusation. The patient was in cardiac tamponade, Laura said, her voice steady as a baseline monitor. Blood pressure 70/40. Heart rate 142. On-call surgeon was 20 minutes out. The Admiral would have been dead in 6 minutes. That may be true, the board member's voice crackled from the speaker, but protocol exists for a reason. You violated scope of practice, you violated hospital policy, and you endangered a patient. I saved his life, Laura said. Regardless, the investigator looked up from her notes, the decision to perform a surgical procedure without authorization is indefensible. Hospital policy is clear. Hargrove smiled. Small, satisfied. He'd orchestrated this symphony perfectly, liability contained, competence protected, the whole thing wrapped in procedure and protocol and the unimpeachable language of institutional self-defense. Laura had saved an admiral and it was going to cost her everything because Hargrove understood something fundamental about power. It wasn't about who was right. It was about who could make the official version of events stick. "We're suspending you pending a full investigation," Paulson said quietly. "You'll surrender your badge, your access codes, and your stethoscope. Security will escort you out." Laura reached up and unclipped her badge. She'd had it for 3 years. 3 years of invisible competence, of holding herself smaller than she was, of choosing the quiet that had felt like healing and turned out to be hibernation. She set the badge on the table. The plastic was warm from her body. She pulled the stethoscope from around her neck, the same one she'd carried through Marja, the one she'd worn in field hospitals made of sandbags and prayer, and placed it next to the badge. Her hand brushed the inside of her jacket as she straightened, feeling the rough thread of the faded unit patch she'd sewn there years ago when she was still someone people saluted. She didn't pull it out. That secret stayed buried. Security arrived at 10:41 a.m., 2 guards in polo shirts who looked uncomfortable, like they'd been asked to remove someone's organs instead of just walking them through a hallway. Laura walked between them with her shoulders back, her chin level, her expression so neutral it looked like peace. But that wasn't what her body was screaming underneath. That was just the mask, the one she'd learned to wear so perfectly that even she sometimes forgot it was a mask. The main lobby of Oak Creek Memorial was busy, patients, families, staff, people pretending not to watch while watching everything. Laura's face never changed as they walked toward the exit doors, but she could feel the weight of attention, the whispered conversations that stopped when she passed and resumed once she was gone. A doctor she'd worked with in the ER for 2 years suddenly found something very interesting to read on his tablet. A nurse from orthopedics turned the other direction. The Admiral's wife sat in the waiting area with her hands folded, and Laura watched recognition flicker across her face, confusion at seeing the nurse who'd saved her husband's life being escorted out like a criminal. The doors opened. The Savannah heat hit like a wall, already humid at 11 a.m., carrying the smell of asphalt and rain from the morning downpour. Laura stepped outside. The security guards watched her cross to her car, maintaining professional distance, and she drove away without looking back at the hospital, which would make her decision in less than 24 hours to call her back. That evening, Laura sat at her kitchen table in her scrubs. She'd never changed out of them, couldn't bear to undress in the apartment, couldn't bear to move at all, really, just existed in the chair with her hands folded and her eyes fixed on nothing. The scrubs were still damp with humidity and the day's accumulated sweat and the knowledge that she might never wear a uniform again, official or otherwise. Emma came home at 5:56 p.m. with her soccer bag slung across her body and homework tucked under one arm, and she stopped when she saw her mother at the kitchen table in the fading light, still in scrubs, her face a map of somewhere far away. Emma set her bag down slowly, carefully, the way you'd set down something fragile. "Mom? Why are you home early?" Laura looked at her daughter, 17 years old, smart enough to know when something was wrong, brave enough to ask the question anyway. She'd hidden from so much to protect this girl from the weight of her past, from the nightmares that sometimes woke her at 3 a.m. in a panic, from the cold clinical way she'd learned to assess whether humans would live or die. She'd thought silence was protection. She'd thought distance was safety. She couldn't find words. There were no words that would explain how you could be good at something, truly good, the kind of good that meant knowing exactly where to place a needle between ribs to drain blood that was crushing a heart, and still lose everything because the institution you served didn't want to admit it needed you more than it needed its protocol. "I made a choice today," Laura finally said, her voice stripped of everything except the raw bone of truth. "I saved someone's life. And it cost me my job." Emma sat down across from her, and for a moment they were just two people at a kitchen table, a mother and a daughter, and the space between what had been and what would come next. Emma reached across the table and took her mother's hand, and that touch was the first thing to break through the armor in hours. "Tell me," Emma said. "Tell me everything." Laura's phone sat on the counter, silent and waiting. In the morning, when a Navy convoy pulled up to Oak Creek Memorial, everything would change again. But tonight, for these last hours of not knowing what was about to arrive at that hospital's main entrance, Laura Bennett sat with her daughter's hand in hers and began to speak the truth she'd buried for 18 years. 24 hours after Laura's suspension, the morning broke cold and grey over Savannah, the kind of dawn that feels like a warning. The convoy arrived at 8:27 a.m., for Navy personnel in dress uniforms, creases sharp enough to cut, walking through the main lobby of Oak Creek Memorial like they owned the air around them. The lead officer was barrel-chested, shoulders built like load-bearing walls, his insignia marking him as a lieutenant commander. Behind him came three more, a Navy judge advocate captain, a hospital liaison officer, and a communications specialist with a briefcase that probably cost more than most people's cars. Security stopped them at the information desk, but the lieutenant commander simply said, "Find Senior Chief Bennett." That's not a request. That's a command, and something in his voice made people move. Laura had no idea they were coming. Emma, her daughter, had arrived at Oak Creek Memorial that same morning carrying a lunch container with yesterday's untouched pasta, worried that her mother hadn't eaten since the suspension letter came down. She was in the lobby when the uniforms appeared, watching them stride past with the kind of purpose that makes civilians instinctively step aside. Emma didn't recognize them at first, didn't understand why four Navy officers in dress blues were moving through the hospital like they were searching for someone, asking staff at every station, "Senior Chief Bennett. Where is Senior Chief Bennett?" The words meant nothing to her. Her mother was Laura Bennett, the quiet nurse who worked extra shifts and came home exhausted and never talked about the scars on her hands or the nightmares that sometimes woke her at 3 in the morning. That's when one of the nurses at the reception desk, Patricia, who'd known Laura for 3 years, pointed toward Emma and said, "That's her daughter." The lieutenant commander turned, studied Emma for a long moment with eyes the color of weathered steel, and asked, "Are you connected to Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett?" Emma's voice trembled. "My mom is Laura Bennett. She's a senior chief." The question mark at the end of her sentence fell into the sudden quiet of the lobby like a stone into water. Around her, staff stopped moving. One of the nurses, young Katie, the same one who'd whispered, "Stay in your lane," turned pale. Patricia opened a personnel file with shaking hands, reading the entries aloud as if the words might somehow make sense of the woman she'd worked beside for 36 months, Laura Bennett, Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, Combat Medical Specialist, active duty 18 years, 3 overseas deployments. Each line landed harder than the last. The barrel-chested SEAL team leader cut in, his voice cutting through the silence with the precision of a blade. "Senior Chief Bennett holds 2 Navy crosses," he said, pausing between each sentence like punctuation marks. "A Silver Star. The Distinguished Service Medal." He pulled a photograph from inside his jacket, blurred, combat zone photography, a woman in field medical gear with a tourniquet wrapped around her wrist, 3 wounded men laid out in front of her, Marja visible in the background, 2012. She performed field surgery under active enemy fire in Helmand Province, Marja District, the officer continued. 14 combatants saved. One of them is the Admiral who arrived unconscious at your facility 48 hours ago. She was the difference between his name on a memorial wall and him coming home to his family. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their mechanical song. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. A Navy judge advocate captain stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. "The Admiral has formally requested Senior Chief Bennett's immediate reinstatement." He opened a tablet, turned it toward the hospital administrator who'd appeared in the lobby doorway. He's also filed a formal complaint requesting the termination of Dr. Marcus Hargrove for gross negligence, endangerment of a flag officer, and dereliction of duty regarding patient care protocols. The words came out measured and precise, each one a legal nail in a coffin. "The Navy is not asking for your cooperation. We are informing you of the outcome. You will comply, or we will have investigators on site within 4 hours." Dr. Hargrove chose that moment to stride into the lobby from the stairwell, moving with the confidence of a man who still believed his position was unshakable. He'd heard the commotion, probably assumed some administrative emergency, and came down to assert control. The moment he saw the uniforms, his face went the color of old bone. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The lieutenant commander met his eyes, just held his gaze, a look that contained 18 years of combat experience and the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly how much damage hands can do when they're trained properly, and Hargrove's shoulders collapsed inward like someone had cut strings. "You need to leave," the judge advocate said to Hargrove. Your hospital privileges are suspended pending federal investigation. Security will escort you from the building. Do not contact any staff members. Do not enter any clinical areas. Do not access any patient records. The voice was utterly flat, utterly final. Hargrove tried to speak. This is political. I was protecting the hospital from liability, but the lieutenant commander cut him off with 2 words, "You failed." That's all. 2 words, and the entire weight of Hargrove's collapsed authority crystallized into a single moment of understanding that he'd gambled wrong, chosen the wrong patient to sacrifice, antagonized the wrong nurse. The hospital administrator pulled out her phone. Moments later, the board members who'd signed off on the suspension the day before began appearing on a video call, their faces visible on a conference room monitor that the communications specialist had set up. One of them was already speaking to a news camera positioned at the hospital's front entrance. The Admiral's story was already going public, and the board was already sensing which way the wind was blowing. "We were given incomplete information," the board member said, his voice carefully neutral for the cameras. Dr. Hargrove misrepresented the clinical situation. "We acted on the information provided to us. Had we known the full scope of his conduct and Senior Chief Bennett's background, our decision would have been entirely different." Translation: "We're cutting him loose. Save ourselves." The nursing program director Hargrove had called, had leveraged to investigate Laura. He hung up without speaking when Hargrove tried to reach him, the message clear. The nursing board investigator quietly closed his briefcase, caught Laura's eye, and gave the smallest nod, his mouth forming silent words, "You're clear." Dr. Chen, Hargrove's handpicked protégé, looked away as security escorted the chief of surgery past the nurse's station, his career imploding in real time with the brutal precision of a building demolition. The same nurses who'd stood and left when Laura sat down with her coffee yesterday now watched Hargrove being walked toward the exit doors. Katie turned away, unable to meet anyone's eyes. A young resident whispered something to a colleague. The entire machinery of institutional loyalty that had turned against Laura 24 hours earlier simply reversed course, the way water flows downhill, not out of principle, but out of self-preservation. Emma called her mother at 9:23 a.m. Laura heard her daughter's voice crack, "Mom, there are Navy people here. They're looking for you. They keep saying a senior chief." "Mom, what?" Laura was in her car and driving before Emma finished the sentence, moving through the morning traffic of Savannah with her hand steady on the wheel, her jaw clenched, her mind running through scenarios she'd buried 18 years ago. She arrived at Oak Creek Memorial at 9:33 a.m., still in yesterday's scrubs, still looking like a woman whose world had been dismantled in 24 hours. The moment she walked through the lobby doors, the whispers started. Laura Bennett, the quiet ICU nurse, the one who kept to herself, who never talked about her past, who had scars on her hands that didn't match any civilian explanation. The Navy uniforms turned in unison, a movement synchronized by training, and the lieutenant commander stepped forward and rendered a salute, formal, crisp, the kind of salute that acknowledged something fundamental about rank and sacrifice. After a moment's hesitation, Laura returned it, her hand rising to her forehead with the muscle memory of 18 years dormant but never forgotten, and something shifted in the air pressure of that lobby, a recalibration of reality. Patricia approached with the personnel file still open in her hands. "Senior Chief, we had no idea. I'm so sorry." The title hung in the air like an object she was only just learning how to see. Laura's voice, when she spoke, was quiet but carried a weight that made everyone listen. "I needed you not to know. I needed to be nobody for a while." Emma was there, having run downstairs the moment security called to say her mother had arrived, and she threw her arms around Laura, sobbing, finally understanding, finally seeing. The news cameras captured everything, were filming from outside the glass doors, capturing the woman in yesterday's scrubs returning a military salute in the lobby of a civilian hospital, capturing the identity reveal that had been written across her body all along but invisible to everyone who wasn't trained to read scars. Someone thrust a microphone toward Laura. "Senior Chief Bennett, can you comment on Dr. Hargrove? Do you think his punishment is adequate?" Laura took one measured breath, the kind of breath that came from 1,000 moments of waiting for the right second to move, and she said quietly, Dr. Hargrove did what he thought protected his position. "I just wish he'd spent that energy protecting his patients." That single sentence, delivered in a voice like a tank idling in a garage, silenced the entire lobby. It wasn't angry. It wasn't vindictive. It was just true, and the truth carries a weight that rage never can. 6 months later, someone spotted Dr. Hargrove teaching CPR certification courses at Coastal Community College, working minimum wage, his hands demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy, his face aged and hollowed out by the kind of professional death that comes from being named in federal investigation reports. No hospital would touch him anymore. The medical licensing board had flagged his file. The news coverage had been relentless. The Navy's quiet official statement that an officer's life had been endangered by negligent physician conduct had been enough to ensure that no major institution would ever hire him again. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment on what amounted to substitute teacher wages, and sometimes he'd demonstrate the right-hand placement to distracted community college students and wonder how 18 years of climbing the ladder had taken him to a place where he was teaching the basics to people who weren't even listening. Back at Oak Creek Memorial, the Admiral completed his cardiac rehabilitation and prepared for return to limited duty, his recovery a testament to 18 minutes of surgical intervention by hands that everyone had tried to push away. The first time he walked back into his recovery room, Laura was there, holding something small and faded in her palms, a unit patch, 18 years old, sewn inside the lining of her jacket, the same insignia he'd worn in Marja when she'd saved his life the first time. Admiral Westbrook gripped her hand, his eyes wet with understanding, and whispered, "I knew those hands, Senior Chief. I never forgot. When I saw you work, even unconscious, some part of me recognized you." His wife embraced Laura, her voice breaking with gratitude. Emma watched from the doorway, finally understanding the quiet strength her mother had carried all along, not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. Gunny Wade, discharged now and visiting, shook Laura's hand with the respect of one warrior for another. "You earned the right to walk away, Senior Chief," he said. "And you earned the right to come back on your terms." Laura returned to Oak Creek Memorial as clinical nurse specialist, heading a new veteran integration program, ensuring that future patients carrying invisible wounds would be seen by someone who understood what those wounds actually weighed. The nightmares had lessened. The faded unit patch was still there, still touching her skin some mornings, a reminder of who she'd been and who she'd chosen to become. She walked through the ICU now with a different kind of authority, not demanding, but earned, and the nurses and doctors nodded with respect as she passed, not because she'd been validated by military protocol, but because they'd finally understood what competence actually looked like when it walked quietly past their station every single day. True class is what you do when the lights go out. Laura Bennett had spent 18 years proving it in the dark, and when the lights finally came on, everyone else was just catching up. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated and lived long enough to prove them wrong, subscribe for more stories of quiet warriors and institutional reckoning. Like this video if you believe the best people in a crisis are often the ones nobody's watching. Comment below, have you ever been judged by someone who didn't know your full story?